Captain Sarah Chen adjusted her dress uniform one final time as she walked through the corridor of Fort Reynolds. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Today marked the annual Distinguished Service Awards ceremony, an event that brought together officers from multiple units across the base. Sarah had been looking forward to this day for weeks, not because she expected to receive an award herself, but because she genuinely respected the tradition of honoring exceptional service members. At 28, she had already served 8 years in the military, working her way up through various assignments that had taken her from small outposts to major command centers. As she entered the main hall where the ceremony would take place, Sarah noticed the familiar divide that often occurred at such formal gatherings. Senior officers clustered in small groups near the front, their chest ribbons and insignia gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Junior officers and enlisted personnel filled the remaining seats, maintaining the unspoken hierarchy that governed military life. What Sarah didn't expect was the immediate shift in atmosphere when she walked into the room. Conversations seemed to pause momentarily as heads turned in her direction. She had grown accustomed to being one of the few women in many military settings, but something about today felt different. The stares lingered longer than usual, and she caught fragments of whispered conversations that made her uncomfortable. "Who does she think she is?" she heard someone mutter from a group of male officers near the refreshment table. Sarah chose a seat in the middle section, close enough to show proper respect for the ceremony but not so close as to draw unwanted attention. She opened her program and began reading through the list of award recipients, genuinely interested in learning about their achievements. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a stocky man with graying temples, approached her section with 2 other officers. Sarah recognized him from previous base functions, though they had never been formally introduced. Morrison had a reputation for being old-school military, someone who believed strongly in traditional values and established hierarchies. "Excuse me, Captain," Morrison said, his voice carrying a tone of authority mixed with something else Sarah couldn't quite identify. "I believe there might be some confusion about seating arrangements." Sarah looked up from her program, meeting Morrison's gaze directly. "I'm sorry, sir." "Is there a problem?" "Well, it's just that this section is typically reserved for officers with specific command experience. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable toward the back with the other junior officers." The suggestion hung in the air like an unwelcome cloud. Sarah felt the familiar knot in her stomach that came with these kinds of encounters. She had faced similar situations before, moments when her qualifications were questioned not because of her performance or experience, but because of assumptions people made about her based on her appearance. "I appreciate your concern, sir," Sarah replied calmly, "but I believe my seating is appropriate for my position." Morrison's expression hardened slightly. The 2 officers flanking him exchanged glances that suggested they shared his perspective on the matter. "Captain, I've been in the military for over 20 years. I think I know something about proper protocol and respect for rank structure." Other attendees in nearby seats began to take notice of the conversation. Sarah felt multiple pairs of eyes focusing on her, creating an uncomfortable spotlight effect. She had 2 choices. She could move to avoid a scene, or she could hold her ground and risk escalating the situation. "Sir, with all due respect, I'm familiar with military protocol as well. My seating assignment is based on my current position and responsibilities." Morrison's face reddened slightly. "Your current position? Captain, you look like you just graduated from the academy yesterday. Some of us have earned our positions through years of service and sacrifice." The comment stung more than Sarah wanted to admit. She had indeed worked hard to reach her current rank, facing obstacles and challenges that many of her male counterparts never encountered. Every promotion had been earned through exceptional performance, often requiring her to prove herself repeatedly in ways that seemed unnecessary for others. "I understand the value of experience, sir," Sarah said, maintaining her composure despite the growing tension. "I've worked hard to earn my position, just like everyone else here." By this point, the conversation had attracted the attention of several nearby officers. Some watched with obvious interest, while others seemed uncomfortable with the public nature of the disagreement. Sarah noticed a few supportive faces in the crowd, fellow officers who had witnessed similar situations before. Colonel Patricia Williams, the base's senior female officer, approached the group, She had been Sarah's mentor during her early years on the base, and had always been supportive of younger officers regardless of gender. "Gentlemen, ladies," Colonel Williams said, with the authority that came with her rank and experience, "perhaps we should focus on preparing for the ceremony rather than discussing seating arrangements." Morrison turned to Colonel Williams with a slight bow of his head. "Of course, Colonel. I was simply trying to help this young captain find an appropriate seat." "I'm sure Captain Chen is perfectly capable of selecting her own seat," Colonel Williams replied diplomatically, though Sarah detected a slight edge in her voice. As the group began to disperse, Morrison leaned slightly closer to Sarah. "Captain, a word of advice. In the military, respect is earned, not demanded. Perhaps you should consider what you've actually accomplished before claiming positions you haven't earned." The words hit their mark. Sarah felt her hands clench slightly as she fought to maintain her professional demeanor. She had spent years proving herself. Years of working twice as hard to receive half the recognition. Years of maintaining perfect composure in situations that would have broken lesser individuals. "Thank you for the advice, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. As Morrison and his colleagues moved away, Sarah remained in her seat, staring at the program in her hands, without really seeing the words. The ceremony would begin in just a few minutes, and she needed to compose herself. She had faced discrimination before, and had always found ways to rise above it. But something about this encounter felt particularly cutting. Colonel Williams lingered nearby for a moment, catching Sarah's eye with a supportive nod before taking her own seat near the front. That small gesture of solidarity helped restore some of Sarah's confidence, reminding her that she did have allies and supporters within the military community. The hall began to fill with more attendees as the ceremony's start time approached. Sarah watched as officers of various ranks found their seats, noting the complex social dynamics that governed these formal military gatherings. Despite her encounter with Morrison, she was determined to enjoy the ceremony and honor the service members who would be recognized for their achievements. What Sarah didn't know was that this uncomfortable beginning would soon lead to events that would change everything about how she was perceived at Fort Reynolds. The ceremony began with the traditional posting of colors and the playing of the national anthem. Sarah stood with the rest of the attendees, her hand placed firmly over her heart as the familiar notes filled the hall. Despite the earlier unpleasant encounter, she felt the usual surge of pride that came with these moments of military tradition. Brigadier General Robert Hayes took the podium, his distinguished appearance commanding immediate attention from the assembled crowd. Sarah had heard impressive things about General Hayes from her colleagues. He was known for his fairness, his strategic mind, and his genuine concern for the welfare of all service members under his command. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hayes began, his voice carrying easily throughout the hall. "We gather today to recognize extraordinary service and dedication to our nation. The individuals we honor represent the highest ideals of military service." The first several awards were presented without incident. Sarah watched as officers and enlisted personnel alike stepped forward to receive recognition for their various achievements. Each citation told a story of sacrifice, courage, or exceptional performance that inspired those in attendance. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison sat 3 rows ahead of Sarah, and she noticed him glancing back in her direction several times during the ceremony. Each time their eyes met briefly, he would turn away with an expression that suggested his earlier irritation hadn't diminished. The ceremony proceeded through various categories of awards. Sarah found herself genuinely moved by many of the stories she heard. A young sergeant had risked his life to save wounded comrades during a training accident. A major had developed innovative logistics procedures that improved efficiency across multiple units. A captain had led humanitarian efforts in a disaster-stricken civilian community. When they reached the category for strategic planning excellence, Sarah's attention sharpened. This was an area where she had significant experience, having worked on several complex planning initiatives during her recent assignment. The presenter began reading the citation for the award recipient. The recipient of this year's Strategic Planning Excellence Award demonstrated exceptional skill in developing comprehensive operational frameworks that improved mission effectiveness while reducing resource requirements. Their innovative approach to complex logistical challenges resulted in cost savings of over $2 million and improved readiness ratings across multiple units. Sarah felt a flutter of recognition. Some of the described accomplishments sounded familiar, though she couldn't quite place why. This officer's planning expertise contributed directly to the success of Operation Mountain Shield, a complex multi-unit exercise that tested our force's ability to respond rapidly to emerging threats. Their strategic insights proved invaluable in coordinating resources across different command structures. The description continued, and Sarah realized with growing surprise that the achievements being described matched work she had done during her previous assignment. But surely there was some mistake. She hadn't been informed about receiving any awards. Please join me in recognizing Captain Sarah Chen for her outstanding contributions to strategic planning excellence. A moment of stunned silence fell over Sarah as she heard her name called. Around her, she could feel the surprise rippling through the audience. Several officers turned to look at her with expressions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's head snapped around so quickly it was almost audible. His face had gone from its normal color to a deep red as he stared at Sarah with undisguised shock. Sarah rose from her seat, her heart pounding as she made her way toward the front of the hall. The walk seemed to take forever as she felt hundreds of eyes following her progress. When she reached the podium, General Hayes smiled warmly and shook her hand before presenting her with the award plaque. "Congratulations, Captain Chen," General Hayes said, his voice carrying a tone of genuine respect. "Your work on Operation Mountain Shield was exceptional." "Thank you, sir," Sarah managed to reply, still somewhat overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition. As she turned to return to her seat, she could see the mixed reactions throughout the audience. Some officers were applauding politely, while others appeared to be struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Colonel Williams beamed with obvious pride, and several younger officers looked inspired by seeing one of their peers recognized for significant achievements. However, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's expression had moved beyond surprise into something approaching anger. As Sarah walked past his row, he stood abruptly and stepped into the aisle, blocking her path. "Excuse me, Captain," Morrison said loudly enough for nearby attendees to hear clearly. "I think there's been some kind of mistake here." The hall fell silent, except for the whispered conversations of people trying to understand what was happening. Sarah stopped, clutching her award as she faced Morrison's obvious hostility. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," Sarah replied carefully. "What I mean," Morrison continued, his voice rising, "is that there's no way someone with your limited experience could have been responsible for the achievements described in that citation. Operation Mountain Shield involved senior officers with decades of experience." General Hayes had been watching from the podium, and Sarah could see him beginning to move in their direction. However, Morrison seemed oblivious to anything except his own indignation. "Sir, I can assure you that my involvement in Operation Mountain Shield was substantial," Sarah said, maintaining her professional tone despite feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. "Substantial?" Morrison laughed harshly. "Captain, you look like you're barely old enough to have graduated college, let alone have planned major military operations. This is exactly the kind of political correctness that's destroying military standards." The accusation hung in the air like a poison cloud. Sarah felt her face burning with a combination of anger and embarrassment as Morrison's words echoed throughout the silent hall. She was acutely aware that every person in attendance was watching this confrontation unfold. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison," Sarah said, her voice stronger now, "my age and appearance don't determine my qualifications or achievements. I earned this recognition through hard work and proven results." "Proven results?" Morrison's voice had become almost a shout now. "I've been in this military for over 20 years, and I've never seen such obvious favoritism. This is an insult to every real officer who has earned their position through genuine service." Several officers in the nearby seats began to look extremely uncomfortable. A few started to rise from their seats, perhaps intending to intervene. But Morrison was far from finished. "You want to talk about respect and protocol, Captain? How about showing some respect for the officers who have actually sacrificed for this country, instead of riding the coattails of diversity initiatives?" The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had faced discrimination before, but never in such a public forum, and never with such vicious personal attacks. Every assumption she had encountered throughout her career seemed to be crystallizing in Morrison's angry words. "Sir," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain composed, "I have served my country with honor and dedication. My achievements stand on their own merit." "Merit?" Morrison stepped closer, his face now inches from Sarah's. "I'll show you what real military merit looks like." All. What happened next occurred so quickly that many witnesses would later struggle to describe the exact sequence of events. Morrison raised his hand, clearly intending to strike Sarah across the face in what appeared to be a moment of complete loss of control. Sarah, trained in defensive techniques and with reflexes honed by years of military training, began to step backward to avoid the blow. Her award plaque fell to the floor with a metallic clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent hall. But before Morrison's hand could complete its trajectory, a commanding voice rang out across the entire assembly with the force of absolute authority. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, stand down immediately." The voice belonged to General Hayes, but it carried a tone that Sarah had never heard from him before. Every person in the hall froze as if turned to stone, including Morrison, whose raised hand stopped mid-swing. General Hayes strode down from the podium with measured, deliberate steps that echoed throughout the completely silent hall. His expression had transformed from the warm demeanor he had displayed during the award presentations to something far more serious and commanding. Every eye in the room followed his progress as he approached the frozen tableau where Morrison stood with his hand still raised. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison," General Hayes said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Lower your hand and step back immediately." Morrison seemed to shake himself from whatever fury had possessed him. His hand slowly lowered to his side, but his face remained flushed with anger and confusion. The reality of what he had almost done appeared to be sinking in, along with the recognition that he was now facing serious consequences. "Sir, this captain," Morrison began, but General Hayes cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Not another word, Lieutenant Colonel. You will remain silent until I give you permission to speak." Sarah bent down to retrieve her fallen award plaque, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. As she straightened up, she caught General Hayes's eye, and she was surprised to see something in his expression that looked almost like an apology. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hayes announced, addressing the entire assembly, "what you have just witnessed is completely unacceptable behavior that violates every principle of military conduct and professionalism." He paused, allowing his words to resonate throughout the hall before continuing. "However, this incident has also revealed a more systemic problem that we need to address immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's behavior stems from assumptions and prejudices that have no place in our military." General Hayes turned to face Morrison directly. "Lieutenant Colonel, your actions today demonstrate a fundamental failure to understand both military protocol and the true nature of the officer you just attempted to assault." Morrison's confusion was evident as he struggled to understand what General Hayes meant. Several other officers in the audience appeared equally puzzled by the general's words. "Captain Chen," General Hayes said, turning to Sarah, "would you please step forward?" Sarah moved closer to the general, still uncertain about what was happening but trusting in his leadership. The hall remained absolutely silent as everyone waited to understand the significance of this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hayes announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I believe it's time for some necessary clarification about the officer you've just witnessed being subjected to discrimination and very nearly physical assault." He gestured toward Sarah with obvious respect. "Captain Chen's uniform today displays the rank insignia appropriate for this formal ceremony. However, what Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and many of you don't realize is that Captain Chen is not just any captain." The tension in the room was almost palpable as General Hayes continued. "Captain Chen is currently serving in a classified position that requires her to wear standard company-grade officer insignia for operational security purposes. Her actual rank and position are significantly different from what her uniform suggests." Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized General Hayes was about to reveal information that had been carefully guarded throughout her assignment at Fort Reynolds. She had been operating under cover, so to speak, for the past 6 months as part of a special assessment program. "The woman standing before you," General Hayes announced with unmistakable pride, "holds the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in Army Intelligence and she currently serves as the Deputy Director of Strategic Planning for the entire Eastern Command. The impact of this revelation was immediate and dramatic. Audible gasps arose from multiple locations throughout the hall. Officers who had been watching the confrontation with casual interest suddenly straightened in their seats. Morrison's face went from red to completely pale as the implications hit him. Furthermore, General Hayes continued, clearly enjoying the shocked reactions around the room. Lieutenant Colonel Chen is currently under consideration for promotion to full colonel, making her not just senior to Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, but actually outranking every officer in this room except myself. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could see officers throughout the hall, rapidly reassessing everything they had witnessed. The casual dismissal, the assumptions about her experience, the accusations of favoritism, all of it was being viewed through a completely different lens. Morrison looked as though he might faint. The officer who had questioned Sarah's right to sit in the middle section, who had accused her of lacking qualifications, who had just attempted to strike her for allegedly receiving undeserved recognition, had just learned that she was actually his superior officer. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, General Hayes said, his voice now carrying the full weight of military justice. You have just attempted to assault a superior officer in front of the entire base command structure. You have questioned the qualifications of an officer whose achievements far exceed your own. You have made accusations of favoritism against someone who has earned every recognition through exceptional performance. Morrison tried to speak, but only managed to produce a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at an apology. But perhaps most seriously, General Hayes continued, you have revealed attitudes and prejudices that are completely incompatible with military service. Your assumptions about Lieutenant Colonel Chen were based entirely on her gender and apparent age, with no consideration of her actual qualifications or achievements. Sarah stepped forward slightly, feeling that she needed to address the situation directly. General Hayes, if I may speak? Of course, Lieutenant Colonel. The use of her actual rank sent another ripple of adjustment through the audience, as officers who had been treating her as a junior captain suddenly realized they were listening to one of the most senior officers on the base. Thank you, sir. Sarah turned to address Morrison directly, her voice now carrying the authority of her true position. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, I want you to understand something important. The work you questioned, the achievements you claimed I couldn't possibly have earned, represent just a small portion of my actual service record. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. Operation Mountain Shield, which you seem to think was beyond my capabilities, was actually designed and planned under my direct supervision. The cost savings and efficiency improvements mentioned in my award citation were the result of strategic frameworks I developed personally. Morrison's shoulders seemed to sag under the weight of his situation. Around the hall, other officers were beginning to whisper among themselves as they processed the dramatic reversal of the confrontation they had witnessed. But more importantly, Sarah continued, this incident illustrates exactly why my current assignment exists. I've been operating undercover for the past 6 months to assess how female officers are treated at various commands, particularly when their rank and position aren't immediately obvious. The implications of this statement sent another wave of unease through the audience. Officers began to wonder about their own interactions with Sarah over the past months, reconsidering conversations and encounters through this new lens. General Hayes stepped forward again. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, you are hereby relieved of your current duties pending a full investigation into this incident. You will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning to begin formal disciplinary proceedings. Morrison nodded mutely, apparently unable to trust his voice. As for the rest of you, General Hayes announced, addressing the entire assembly, I want this incident to serve as a reminder that respect in the military should be based on competence and character, not on assumptions about age, gender, or appearance. He gestured toward Sarah with obvious respect. Lieutenant Colonel Chen has dedicated her career to serving this country with distinction. Her record includes commendations for strategic planning, operational excellence, and leadership under challenging conditions. She has earned her position through merit, and she deserves the respect that rank and achievement command. Colonel Williams was beaming with obvious pride as she watched the proceedings. Several younger officers in the audience looked inspired by the dramatic revelation and Sarah's composure throughout the ordeal. "This ceremony will now continue," General Hayes announced. "But I want everyone to remember what you've witnessed here today. Excellence comes in many forms, and our military is stronger when we recognize and support it wherever we find it." As the formal ceremony resumed, Sarah noticed the dramatic change in how other officers regarded her. Where before she had faced questioning looks and casual dismissal, she now encountered respectful nods and obvious deference to her actual rank and position. The incident with Morrison had revealed more than just one officer's prejudices. It had exposed systemic assumptions that affected how many people perceived women in the military. Sarah's undercover assignment would continue for several more weeks. But this public revelation would undoubtedly change the nature of her observations. As she returned to her seat, Sarah reflected on the strange turn of events. She had come to the ceremony expecting a quiet afternoon of honoring fellow service members. Instead, she had received an unexpected award, faced public discrimination, nearly been assaulted, and had her true identity revealed in the most dramatic possible circumstances. The remainder of the ceremony proceeded without incident, but Sarah knew that the real impact of these events would be felt for months to come across Fort Reynolds.